Welcome to the Disaster Regeneration Summit. The summit is a gathering where resilience meets imagination and recovery becomes regeneration. Hosted by the Permaculture Institute of North America, or PINA, we honor the truth that every crisis opens space for new growth. Together, we are learning to prepare with foresight, respond with care, and rebuild with wisdom. Rooted in permaculture, inspired by nature, and connected through community. And I try to change that every day. I don't know if y'all have noticed, so it doesn't get boring hearing the same old thing, but I like that one. So, just a couple notes. I want to shout out Rebecca. This is my colleague and friend at PINA, and some of you know her. She handles all things membership. So, if you have any membership questions or have ever had any membership questions, you may have interfaced with Rebecca. She's fantastic. She's going to be running sort of tech and breakout rooms. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat for her. Her email is memberships@pina.in. So thank you, Rebecca, for being here. She's also going to drop in a discount code. If you want to become a PINA member, we have a special code for this week during the summit that you can get it for 20% off. So might as well do it if you're thinking about it or on the fence at all. And truly, these summits being made for free and bringing in awesome speakers like Brock are actually like supported by membership. So it really does matter, and it helps amplify the voice of permaculture, I hope, even increasingly so going into the future. So thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everybody for being here. Brock Dolman is a biologist, innovative permaculture designer, and internationally recognized watershed advocate. As co-founder of the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center in California, he directs the Water Institute, which stands for Watershed Advocacy, Training, Education, and Research, and has spent over 25 years teaching and implementing regenerative design. His work focuses on, quote, basins of relations, restoring ecological balance, building community resilience, and preparing for climate challenges through nature-based solutions. Brock, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Yeah, happy to be here with y'all and see a few familiar faces, and nice to meet those of you who I haven't met before. Yeah, happy to be here and happy to support the work of PINA. For sure, I think relative to permaculture, OAC, we were founded in 94, so last year was our 30th anniversary. And then in 95, the first workshop that we really hosted OAC was actually a permaculture design course with Penny Livingston and Hazel, known at that time as Tom Ward. And that was our first PDC in 95. So this is our 30th year of doing PDCs, and we haven't missed a year in 30 years. We've been doing 2 to 3 a year for that long at this point. So I think we're kind of one of the longest running shops in probably around basically at this point.
Yeah, totally. You and Bob Randall. I think Bob's got a 30 years under his belt or something like that. He can speak to that at some point. But in Houston, yeah.
Right.
But
yeah.
Brock, in case people don't know your origin story, maybe you can just quickly say kind of like where you were from, what your childhood was like, and just like major stepping stones that lead you to being here today.
Sure. So I'm a Marine brat. I was, shall we say, I was conceived in Idaho and born on a military base in Tennessee, and then I've never returned to anywhere I grew up in before. We just kept moving to the next place. My earliest upbringings memories were Japan. My family's all Idaho, Montana. Got the family cabin near West Yellowstone, Tetons. Did a lot of Southern California, East Coast, Chesapeake Bay, high school, middle school, high school, kind of there. So all of that was good training for engaging in diverse ecosystems and ecosystems to kind of tune up on being a specialized generalist, which was the foundation of becoming a permaculturalist at some point. And yeah, high school, I worked my junior, senior year, I went to school half a day, and then I went to work for the second half of the day, which was managing a landscape crew at a nuclear power plant, Calvert Cliffs Power Plant in Calvert County, Maryland. So I have a lot of karma to pay back after, spraying all that Roundup on the double razor wire fence and weed eating with my own, with the cooling ponds where the rods are stored and all that lovely stuff. And so went from a very non-organic regenerative piece to this work. But I'm a biologist by birth when all is said and done. And I went to community college, studied horticulture at Cabrillo College with Rich Merrill, if you've known him, in California in the 80s, and then eventually transferred to UC Santa Cruz, did a double major in agroecology with Steve Gleasman and conservation biology. A number of folks like Dr. Ken Norris and Michael Soule and people like that. So always been interested in the nexus of broader ecological systems and the overlap with human land uses of agriculture, forestry, rangeland, intensive, extensive ag, and how to harmonize those in some way that's good for all species for all time.
Where did permaculture sort of slot in your journey? When did you learn about it, and what sort of bit you about it that kept you focused on it?
I didn't actually really. I got introduced to permaculture in '95, a month after we bought, or actually '94. I mean, we bought the land in August of '94, and there was a permaculture convergence happening up in the Mid Klamath at a place called Sandy Bar Ranch with Mark and Blythe up there. And so, friend picked me up in Santa Cruz, and I had the designer's manual before me, an 8-hour car ride, and worked that sucker over and showed up at the convergence and walked in there, and there was Penny Livingston and James Stark and Toby Hemingway and Bill Rowley and Keith Johnson and oh geez, Larry Santoyo and just the whole cast of characters. And that convergence was my intro. And that's where I met Penny and Hazel. That was there obviously. And out of that invited them to then come teach that first PDC the next year in '95 at OAC. And then from there on out, I don't know. I taught, I don't know, 150 PDCs at this point. I got to be the co-lead for the IPC in Brazil in '07. I got to be the co-lead at the IPC in Cuba in 2013. And I've gotten to teach and travel and do permaculture related work in over 20 countries at this point. I just got back yesterday from working with the Bushmen, San Bushmen in South Africa, actually. So very fun.
Yeah, excellent work. And it's been great to follow your career over the years. You got some beavers behind you. So without further ado, I'll let you jump into their story a little bit. And we're really looking forward to it,
Sure.
Brock. Thanks so much for being here again.
Yeah. Let me share this show and we will drop into this stuff. That working?
Looks great.
All right. Okie doke. Well, thanks for being here, y'all. And I got a hefty, fast moving show for you here. And then with the intention of leaving time for us to converse about it and hopefully have some breakout rooms and that kind of stuff afterwards. So, it's an interesting thinking about the title, especially around in this whole summit you guys are doing around disaster. And I've been thinking a lot about disaster and the perception of what is a disaster and of who's making and who's what are the conditions for such things. And so I don't have any explicit answers for that, but I am interested in it and such. And so let's jump into it and just kind of did enough introduction, but for those who don't know, Occidental Ecology Center, and we're in Western Sonoma County in Northern California, and you can check us out. We do have our third PDC of the year coming up in November there, and so there's a QR code if you know of anybody. We've been doing a hybrid course, kind of post-COVID, where there's a series of evenings with the whole online component to it, and then that preps folks for then the intensive in-person section for 10 days. So have a look at that. Let's see. But I do want to I always start off and contextualize the welcome that, welcome to planet water, people, because this is where we're at. And 70% of the surface of this amazing planet is liquid water. We've got the gaseous state. We've got all the fresh water on our continents and the vegetation. And the cool thing is, as a biologist, I think is really recognizing that it's the only known place in the universe, as far as we can tell, where, water is life, where life is endemic. And I'm down for meeting extraterrestrials full on for that. But at this point in time, what I can assure myself as a biologist is that I'm gainfully employed on planet water. I wouldn't be so if I moved to the moon or Mars with Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and have no intention of going there. I'd love it if those two would take off together and go inhabit that place with the other folks who are doing their darndest to screw shit up here on this planet. So we could get back to fixing it up and having an amazing life here. A little paraphrase on Jacques Cousteau, which I really appreciate, is basically, the water cycle and the life cycle are one cycle. And realms of sustainability, even preceding regeneration, I think is really about our ability to sustain the cycles of life, if at all possible. And you know, kind of closed relational loops. I did mention in that intro that my dad was in the Marines. He did 3 tours in Vietnam, and while he was mostly there, we were stationed in Japan. So I'm out hunting tadpoles as a 3-year-old there, and basically never quit hunting tadpoles and figured out how to go get a degree and make a career in chasing frogs and snakes and turtles and getting us 2-legged naked apes on board with how to create conditions conducive for those critters in a good way. And that for me has been permaculture and basins of relations and watersheds and that kind of work. And I think, as many of you know, and we have a booklet at OAC called Basins of Relations. I used to do trainings back in the late 90s, early 2000s called Basins of Relations, starting and standing community watershed groups. And it was really about working at the community scale and relationally, and in the recognition of watersheds as these basins of relations. And then really, how do we rethink for regeneration from the ridge to the river to the reef? What is this reverential, resilient rehydration revolution retrofit going to look like? And I think that's my answer to the sense of so-called disaster, which is, if you hope a disaster isn't coming your way, then take on David Orr's definition of hope, which is hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And so roll up your sleeves and get prepared and create conditions conducive for resiliency in the face of that. I would say ultimately a lot of the work as a biologist that I ended up feel like I do a lot is less work with, or a lot of work with the human communities. And I think what that really looks like in many respects is that when we work in watersheds, we work in the headwaters, and the most important headwaters really is this ecosystem restoration up in the headwaters of our cerebrally impervious headwaters. And how do we engage in that? And I think summits like this and the work of Pina and others of doing community-based support and permaculture design and holistic integrated systems of regeneration is the critical restoring that we need, that we are a part of, not apart from this planet. And how can we re-engage as keystone species again on behalf of resiliency is kind of a fundamental question I'm interested in. And I think as many of us have our own story, and indigenous communities all over the planet have their own phrase or word, this idea that water is life, and super interested in that. And I think even in the climate change space, the recognition of water in the climate thing, I want to talk a little bit about. This is just a funny slide I made up, but it's often there's a sense of incongruity around, quote, global warming. And you're like, well, wait a minute, how can it be cold if it's warming, and all that sort of BS that some of the Republicans use on us, bringing snowballs into the Senate. But the hot flashes, the sweats, the chills, and all of those things are ultimately related to the fact that living on planet water, and to the degree that the planet is running this fossil fuel fever foisted upon us by the oligarchy and the addiction to the combustion of these fossil fuels, and the classic framework that we know about of the greenhouse effect, which is really important, and we're psyched we have it. And the dominant greenhouse gas for a long time, several billion years on this planet, has actually been H2O. But we know there's some other gases, and we've thickened that blanket that has resulted in this warming, this global warming, and that thus accordingly climates change. And I really support us all in differentiating those, because I think people get confused or intentionally confuse others in trying to suggest that those are euphemisms for the same thing, and they're not. It's a sequential causal set of relationships and reactions. And it ultimately boils down to the fact, and if you really want to geek out on it, I'm into basically PCBs, which is physics, chemistry, and biology. And the physics of this planet, the thermodynamics, is that, right, energy is neither created nor destroyed, right? Matter is neither created nor destroyed, and energy is always changing, and we've got this entropic processes happening. But life is negentropic, and for while it's alive, and we're on this Gaianistic planet that's had the presence of life for 3.8 billion years in an unbroken chain, even though there's been 5 massive extinction waves and we're currently in the 6th one. And so that's this really fascinating thing. And a lot of it has to do with the relationship of water and energy. And just to geek out a little bit on this slide, but the idea that water's functionally the only known molecule that we have that within pressures and temperature ranges naturally occurring on this planet will be present in all 3 of its phase states simultaneously in many cases. So the solid crystalline state, the liquid state, or the vapor state. And what's cool is that the way that Mickey Mouse molecule, the H2O molecule with those 2 hydrogens with the plus charges on one end and the oxygen with a negative charge, that bipolar molecule, buying polar isn't a real estate opportunity in the Arctic now that the ice is melting away, although maybe it is for some, is the sense that when you all know this, if I melt an ice cube from solid to liquid on your forehead, you experience that as a cooling reaction because it's an endothermic reaction. It takes in energy. And when you take a jog and that liquid sweat that you're exuding out moves from liquid to vapor, that's a cooling reaction. And that's because, again, there's energy absorbed in that phase state change. And the reverse is true. As vapor goes to liquid, it gives off heat. And when liquid goes to solid, it gives off heat. And these fundamental physics and chemistry of how this miraculous Mickey Mouse molecule performs is at the base of everything the planet is doing to try to turn on the air conditioner and slow down this fossil fuel fever of the planet. And fundamentally, when we look at all the primary indicators of climate change or global warming, look for the signature of water. And whether that is the increase in radical amounts of rainfall or drought, the melting of the poles, the melting of all the glaciers on continental land masses, the sea level rise that's associated with that melting right now, the cyclonic energy that we're witnessing, it's this nexus between water and temperature. And so there you have that. And so I think when I'm looking at and thinking about climate change and really honoring the concept of climate, that, it's really this relationship, again, between temperature and water, and then biology modifies itself to create conditions conducive for more of itself, but it has to adapt to what you got. And here in California, and I'm pick on California because I live here and I'm focused here, but what's a fascinating state, right? It's this massive state. It's a really long state. And imagine this, we have in the Northwest areas that get over 200 inches of rainfall on average. And yet down on the southern end of our Mojave Desert, we get less than 5 inches of rainfall. We have the longest contiguous mountain range in the lower 48 of the Sierra Nevada, where in some places we're averaging of 50 plus feet of snow every year up by Mount Lassen. And the interesting piece of that is that the water resources relate to the vegetation and the biodiversity and the plants and soil organic matter, if you really get into it. And I think that there's a lot of talk, I think, about regeneration, and appropriately so, about recognizing that for those of us who are freaked out about the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, and we want to sequester that atmospheric carbon, and we get this epiphany of like, oh my God, photosynthesis, amazing. And so I always want to give people a quickie tune-up and a reminder on the photosynthetic equation. And I think this tattoo that was on the arm of an intern at OAC some years ago is a wonderful use of ink. And the fun part is we know that within chlorophyll in this molecule, when we get light energy into there, that if the plant can take in 6 molecules of CO2 and critically 6 molecules of H2O, it can recombine those and pop out that sugar molecule and free oxygen. And I think that the fixation on the carbon cycle there, I often experience, and I just listened to one of my favorite authors doing a book reading, I won't mention their name, and they talked about the miracle of photosynthesis. And I just find that they don't mention the water part of it. And I guarantee you that basically, while CO2 and H2O are equal molecular inputs into this equation, that water is the limiting factor. And that difference on the map I just showed you of the Mojave Desert with less than 5 inches of rain versus the Pacific Northwest rainforest, the redwoods at 200, the soil organic matter is proportionate to the availability of rainfall, and CO2 is not limiting proportionally in either of those locations. And so carbon follows water is the piece of it. Once you get carbon in the soil, then you get a virtuous cycle going, and more organic matter can hold more water and all those fun things. But you got to kick it off with water. So I just like to center that from starters, and then really think about the relationship of, as we're atomically carbon based and molecularly mostly water, how that carbon water relationship is what then forms the foundation of our emergent expression of life as embodied evolution, and the systems and the different systems, and how we as systems thinkers, as permaculture designers, can strategically engage in pattern language. And I love chapter 4 in the designer's manual on understanding pattern language and all the different patterns. And obviously the fractal pattern, the dendritic branching pattern, especially as expressed in watersheds, is one of the great patterns. But as forms follow functions, forms can also follow dysfunctions. And so I think that when we have socio-political, economic, religious settlement patterns that see the planet as commodity rather than community, then we get into some of these dysfunctional or degenerative disturbance regimes versus regenerative disturbance regimes. And that's a whole interesting piece of the puzzle. And I live out here in the redwood country, where almost all of our redwoods were logged and most all of our salmon have been harvested, and our, both of those are very limited, and I think that is a disaster in this world of disaster, the disaster of Eurocentric colonialism that literally genocided and plundered the carrying capacity of the biodiversity of these systems for several hundred years, and in the process doing that destabilized the global climate regime to then amplify the climate on steroids for this system that has been so compromised. That to me is the disaster that I'm working with and patterning on. And our creeks here are either flashy and floody in the winter and really dirty, and then in the summertime they're dry because we increased the runoff coefficient and the water left the land and didn't recharge, and it dumped all the dirt in the creeks, and then the uplands aren't recharged, so they don't leak later longer. And for us, our keystone canary in the watershed coal mine, if you will, for us in the Pacific Northwest here is really the various salmonids, and specifically coho salmon in our Russian River is a really critical organism that's born in freshwater, then goes out saltwater, gets really big, and returns to freshwater, spawns and dies, and kicks off a whole cycle again. And the nutrients they bring back from the ocean literally feed the rest of the watershed with the nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. Imagine the fish emulsion. And yet in 2000, our Russian River Basin was down to 6 to 10 individual coho salmon, where we had 50,000 in the 50s. And so we began a lot of work on behalf of those fish. And I think what it belies, and I love this quote by Dr. Luna Leopold, one of the children of Aldo Leopold, is that the health of our waters is the principal measure of how we live on the land. And that, I think, the quantity and quality of water being measures of health. And so I often think about watersheds as these living lifeboats. And from ridge to, down to river mouth and reef, from summit to sea, how do we rethink and retrofit these living lifeboats? And not just, I mean, that's a conceptual poetic piece, but what does it really look like to engage in what I often call conservation hydrology, which precedes conservation biology, or they're intertwined together in this regenerative rehydration of receiving and recharging and retaining and releasing. And how do we rethink our relationship to water and basically move away from the drain age that Western settlement has been so fetishized on. As far as I can tell, we just rolled in, kill all the beavers, drain the wetlands, incise the channels, trapezoidally do that, subdrain the system, pave it over, pave, pipe, pollute, and plunder the system, and then bitch and moan about the fact that you have not as much water, which then necessitates deeper wells and bigger dams and more conveyance to provide water to the few at the expense of the many. So the work of an old friend and colleague, Brad Lancaster, I love Brad's work about pivoting in rainwater harvesting from the drain age to the retain age. In essence, this phrase that I think probably many of you know of mine, the slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it revolution versus the pave it, pipe it, pollute it, plunder it. And I think a lot about the conservation hydrology and water budgets and how do we receive and retain, recharge, release in similar ways, although more complicated than money. And I've done a lot of work with many folks all over California and internationally on this kind of work, which often shows up in the space of stormwater management because we have the Clean Water Act, or we thankfully still do. We'll see how long that lasts under the current regime, but we do for the moment. And so managing stormwater is really one of the great invitations for permaculturalists to engage in whole systems watershed thinking. And this is something we've certainly done a lot at OAC, and lots of on-site water retention and integration and recharge and that kind of stuff for a long time. And we've got a bunch of booklets you can find on our website about different projects that we've done. I do really appreciate this idea by Danny Hagens of Pacific Watershed Associates that nothing in nature mimics a road. And one of the great derangers of hydrology in any watershed is roads, and how roads are put in, and how, when they're not done in a hydrologically invisible, water literate manner, how they can radically derange roads on watersheds. This book on the left, the Handbook for Forest, Ranch, and Rural Roads, is actually, you can get that for free as a downloadable PDF if you just go to Pacific Watershed Associates website and look this up. It's a really big, thick book. It also comes in Spanish, which is really cool. And then the work of the Keyvera Coalition and Bill Zedike and others in the desert. I love this short book about water harvesting from roads. So we do a lot of work in the road space, I will say. And again, that's because we're always thinking, or that our North Star of success is thinking about in-stream flows and water quality and quantity as it relates to how do we create conditions conducive for coho salmon. And so these are a series of booklets that a group of us called the Russian River Coho Water Resources Partnership worked together over a decade in 5 tributaries in the Russian River, trying to figure out how do we engage with our settlement patterns and our urban, rural, suburban, forestry, rangeland, ag spaces to retrofit those in a way where those land uses could continue, but they were done in ways that didn't compromise the water quantity and quality and ultimately the in-stream flows in our creeks. And so lots of education around that and different posters and projects and community organizing over the years. Some peer-reviewed papers I was co-authoring, Dr. Matt Deitch on thinking about this kind of work for the Permies. And you can really see that this kind of stuff, decentralized water management regimes, is really based on a lot of holistic permaculture design thinking, although we're not necessarily centering that on the front end in these more rigorous scientific peer-reviewed journal spaces, but you can read into that. And then I would just pivoting a little bit to say that in the last number of years, I think there's been an increase in a recognition that's wanting to move away from what we often call form-based restoration or sort of static-based restoration. Restoration is based more on nouns and things where you can control it and you fix it and you come up with a static design and then you engineer that and then you expect the system to basically stay to color within the lines. Versus, I think, recognizing what is now called process-based restoration. And this is really pushing on the nature-based solutions world. And so a group of us about 4 years ago, 3-ish, 4 years ago, co-founded what is now called the California Process-Based Restoration Network. There is a wonderful paper by a whole bunch of authors here about design criteria for process-based restoration in fluvial systems that I would recommend for folks. And a lot of this is even more thought of as what we're working on is low-tech process-based restoration. So trying to come up with ways that are less based on the big yellow toys. Not to say there aren't times where some problems were created by those big toys and we're going to have to use them to remedy that. But at some point, as we remedy those structural issues, can we push the system back to where the system, we can defer decision making to the system and have these self-sustaining systems overall by using natural materials and letting the system do the work, and that kind of stuff. And so this is a wonderful manual you can also download that's put out by a whole bunch of authors you can see on the bottom that come out of Utah State University, the Low-Tech Process-Based Restoration of Riverscapes Design Manual, or LTPBR. And yes, they do play with the beer label there. And as far as I can tell so far, the Pabst Blue Ribbon Company hasn't given them any a ration yet over the use of their logo. So that's fun. One of the acronyms we think about in PBR is this idea of STEM, which I know is used in another acronym, but this one means space, time, energy, and materials. And so as a good permaculture designer, when we're faced with a restoration problem, a disaster solution response, if you will, maybe we're in advance of the disaster, we're trying to do preemptive restoration, regeneration. We look at what's the space we have, what's the time we have, what's the energy available, and what are the materials. And I think we will likely note that many of the basic permaculture principles are embedded within this recognition here of working in the dimension of space and time and that kind of stuff. And then, a lot of us, at least in the northern hemisphere, where we have these amazing rodents known with the genus castor, whether it's the North American beaver, Castor canadensis, or the Eurasian beaver, Castor fiber, of being inspired by these critters and what they do. And so there's been a number of papers out there and a lot of work going on around looking at how to use beavers and support beavers to restore ecosystems, and especially incised, entrenched, down-cut channels, which is a plague throughout so many places where this sort of modern industrial dehydration model has been wrought. And so our mantra at OAC is that we fight incision with incisors, and by supporting beavers, we're helping them sink their teeth into this issue. And so we do have this whole Bring Back the Beaver campaign. And you can go to this website. There's a ton of information. We've got a wonderful booklet about creating a culture of stewardship, a ton of stuff on the beaver thing. And this show's not really a beaver show. I've just got a few slides here. We could do a whole show on the beaver game, but I did want to set this context as I head towards the fuels to flows idea about, acknowledging beavers as these actual keystone species where the presence of the modified habitats that they create amplifies the carrying capacity and diversity of opportunity for way more species than just that they themselves are need per se or dependent on, right? And there's a lot of science around looking at the benefits of beaver wetted habitats and how the dams and the wetlands act like shock absorbers and speed bumps to both floods for the deluge part of the system and also retaining water for the drought part of the system. So in that disaster framework of the slow rolling disaster of drought or a fast moving disaster of floods, the attenuation of those systems by beaver wetted habitats, or the crisis of catastrophic fire that's very acute, and these beaver wetted areas. And some work by a number of folks, whether it's Joe Wheaton, whose photo here is taken, showing this massive fire, but that the beaver wetted corridor retained its green, moist wetness. And there's a number of examples of that. And so Dr. Emily Fairfax et al. With other authors published that whole paper about Smokey the Beaver and looking at how beaver dam riparian corridors stay green during wildfire. And that's a really inspiring piece of work that a lot of people have picked up on. A bunch of us have been working on, beaver habitat in California for solidly the last 10 years. I've been in the thick of it for the last 20 plus. And this is a really cool project in some low elevation area, kind of in the Central Valley of California near Auburn, Lincoln, with the Placer Land Trust, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a wonderful company called Swiftwater Design, Kevin Swift. Basically where in the upper left there, you can see they had this big property, Placer Land Trust, and they had levied it off inside those red boundaries to a single threaded channel that they were trying to keep the creek in one threaded channel. And then they were working, planting upland plants, if you will, in that outer area and killing the beavers because they were cutting down their trees. And Fish and Wildlife Service said, well, we'll give you money, but you got to have a beaver peace treaty and stop killing beavers. And what about if we actually doze out, bring in some yellow toys for just a moment, use that diesel wisely, knock out portions of the levee in strategic places to allow the system to reconnect to its historic floodplain, stop killing beavers, do some beaver dam analogs that will help give the beavers a boost so that they can build on it. And that lower image there below is 2 years later with that work with $65,000 and an increase in 1,200% of wetted habitat. That system now is probably 2,000% increase in wetted habitat, and it's just beaver palooza, and it's an amazing space. It's really super fun. And a lot of it gets into, for those of you that are really tracking the whole biotic pump and the small water cycle, new water paradigm kinds of work. How beavers, we think a lot about how beavers are part of that bigger solution. And so there has been a bunch of work, and I think based in large part to the work we did at OAC with a number of others, California now has an actual beaver restoration program through the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and we've been working with tribal groups. They've been doing beaver back or beaver translocations and such, and it's a super exciting time to be in doing this work now. And what's been fun is this Cal PBR network. We do these trainings called Build Like a Beaver, and we get a number, there's whatever, 50 plus folks there, camp out for a week. And these mountain meadows in this case that had been de-beavered and were incised and dehydrating, and they were getting encroached by conifers and at risk of wildfire. And so by removing the conifers and reusing those materials to then act like beavers and build like beavers and prep for beavers to return, in this case, in this watershed, we can do that restoration work. We did another one of those trainings last year, and in fact, we have one coming up, although I think it's already full this year as well. So those are really super fun and hands-on and up in the more zone 5 kind of wildland nexus oftentimes. But pivoting to one of the elemental disasters, if you will, I think is mega fires. And I know for us in California, boy, in the last decades, kind of 2015 till now, we have just experienced so many fires, and they just keep getting so much bigger and so much worse. And the interesting thing is really understanding that it's sure climate change is amplifying, is bumping up the extremity, but it's on a foundation of the deranged condition of our landscapes due to the legacy of the last several hundred years of a pyro-illiterate land use that's related to the dehydration degradation design I was talking about before. And so we have a modern system where they have a low frequency of fire, which means when fire comes, it tends to be very high intensity. And that's the opposite of Euro settlement, when we basically had high frequency of fire and low intensity when we were underneath a traditional cultural indigenous burning regimes. And so here's a classic image that maybe many people have seen, where you're looking down into Yosemite Valley in 1872 when it was made a national park, or that's actually a little bit before. It was actually designated as a park officially, and then all the way up to 2020. And more or less, that's the same image. You can kind of see where El Capitan is and looking towards where Half Dome is and down the valley there in the Merced River. And that open meadow systems, lots of open space down in the valley bottom. If you really could track your trees, you'd see there's a lot more black oaks down there. And that was being engaged and had been managed since time immemorial by various Sierra Miwok tribes and other tribes, primarily using fire. And then fire was outlawed in California, and those Indians, the first laws in the books were that we outlawed Indians from using fire. And we went into this sort of pyro-illiterate Smokey Bear fetish of fighting fire, even though almost every vegetation community in California is a to some degree, one way or another, a fire-dependent ecosystem. And so we end up creating conditions for the conflagration because of our ecological illiteracy. And I think when fire comes, who's responsible for that so-called disaster, I think is one question. I was recently attended a webinar and got to listen to a number of amazing California indigenous peoples and cultural burn practitioners, such as North Fork Monotribal Chairman Ron Good and Jeanette Acosta, who's an amazing indigenous ethnobotanist, cultural fire practitioner, and also a permaculture designer, permaculture teacher. And I've taught a number of PDCs with her through Penny Livingston and Regenerative Design Institute and other places. So, and I really love what they ultimately said here. And I appreciate especially Rod Good's piece there about, fire is about water. And that everybody thinks, hey, you guys are the fire guys. But he was saying, no, we're the water guys, because when we bring water back, when you use fire to refresh the resources, they hold more water. And that's really the point. And Jeanette's idea that water is life and that fire follows water and that beauty follows fire and water. And so I really align a lot with cultural indigenous peoples in their holistic relationship of fire as a verb that's a tool towards the support of water and thus the support of life. And I think that thankfully, as we're moving in California, the greater West, with the return of good fire or prescribed fire, as it's often thought of, that we support those communities in really thinking much more holistically that fire is not the end. It's a tool to get to a much broader holistic means. And again, I think water really is the opportunity there. This is a slide by Dr. Karen Pope on some studies she was done in some mountain meadows, some wet meadows in the Sierra Nevada. And I'm not going to really unpack all the differences between the unburned and burned polygon or the graphs there, because they're a little bit complicated for the time. But just to say the take-home message really is that in these mountain meadows that have been de-beavered, incised, and de-watered and are slowly drying up and becoming more mesic and being invaded by conifers and sagebrush that like drier conditions, that if we are to restore and re-wet those meadows, some folks are saying we need to bring in fire and burn them off. And while that may be a tool in the toolbox, if we don't engage in the channel and use that organic matter to slow spread and sink and re-wet the meadow, and we just use fire, we won't get there. In fact, we'll hasten the demise of the meadows, is what I think many of us are recognizing. And so I love fire, and it's super fascinating. And I've been burning at OAC since the late 90s. We actually did a controlled burn with an amazing group called Fire Forward at Audubon Canyon Ranch in a forest understory space. So fire elementally is a critical tool in the toolbox. But what I think is for me is that before we bring fire back to the land, we need to get in there and do some limbing and thinning and prep and burn prep, because so many of our forests, like that image in the upper left there, are so overstocked and there's such a dog hair thicket because they've been repeatedly clear cut and yet fire suppressed, and they've grown up into these incredible dense stands. And so we need to confidently and safely return fire there. We have to get in and pre-modify those fuels. And at that point, the question is, do you perceive slash as trash, or is it a beneficial biomass? And I think the permaculture framework, right, that waste is the problem is the solution, waste as resource, sees that this biomass is this incredible opportunity that we should honor and integrate. And so we do a lot of work with that for the last 30 years at OAC, which is kind of where I'm going to pivot for the remainder of the show here to look at some of that work. But I keep asking some of the folks that are really, lit up, if you will, about fire, is like, well, what's the fate of this biomass? And if combustion is the only tool in the toolbox, and yet you're trying to reach carbon neutrality and you're worried about atmospheric CO2, I don't think you're going to get there if combustion's your only tool. And I think that integrating compost, i.e. the retention of organic matter in the soil water life cycles terrestrially is critically needed and important. And I think isn't understood enough. And so we have to move from no water, NO, to knowing water, knowing life, knowing carbon, knowing fire, and really increasing our knowledge, if you will. And so a lot of this, again, isn't anything new to those of you that are whole systems permaculture designers who think in these multi-benefit portfolio ways, but I'm amazed at how new this is for so many other folks. But so I offer this idea to people about when I'm brought to a site and we're doing a site assessment and analysis, a sector analysis, all of the tools we use in permaculture are protracted and thoughtful observation work of the what do we got kind of analysis. First is, again, looking at that biomass. If fire fuel load resiliency is a primary goal of the client, then that's fair enough. But what are the steps to get there, and really honoring this idea of high grading that organic matter for soil and water life carbon cycles first before combustion cycles. And so I often put forward this idea of a beneficial biomass portfolio as a design tool to get people to think about there are multiple tactical strategic approaches that we could use for this material. Gully stuffing or habitat piles or lopping and scattering or using, on-site mulch or chips or laying it on contour, biochar burning. Firewood is great. Ground pole construction or other reutilization is great. Cultural fire appropriately, right? So having a diversified portfolio, pretty obvious. This is what a lot of the forest, about 40 acres of the land at OAC looked like when we moved there in 1994. The we, I should say, was 7 people who bought the land together in an intentional community that's called Sowing Circle, SOWING, and that's an LLC. So that's a consensus-based intentional residential community of people who've been living together for 31 years on site in community. And then we co-founded the Oxford Ecology Center simultaneously as the 501c3 nonprofit that does a lot of the social benefit mission-oriented work. But it's all nested within an intentional community. And so this is what we were facing, is these very young, fast-growing, overstocked Douglas firs with lots of dead branches, and they were shading out our native prairies, our native coastal scrub, our oak woodlands, our hardwood evergreens, madrones, and bays, and simplifying the system. Although it is a native tree, and it's a fascinating thing because the keystone processes in a post clear-cut scenario, fire suppression, had released Douglas fir without the control mechanisms of what kept it in check in a mosaic because of the loss of fire and the impact of the disaster of clear cutting. Our land's been clear cut 3 times over since the late 1870s. And so early on, I came, with this mantra that we need fewer trees and more forest and more flow, and flows of all matter and such. And so we've been working on that kind of work for a long time. I do want, because I know that the word thinning is a trigger word for many people, and I understand why it is, especially because in a industrial, extractive, commodified, commercial space, and increasingly, I would say we're suffering through the euphemism of healthy forests and using thinning as a guise to basically rape and plunder our forests at this point in time and return logging. And so when I'm, there are these types of thinning projects or these salvage logging projects that are being sold to us as if they're somehow holistic and integrated, and it's bullshit, just to be frank about it. So what I'm really want to talk about is thinking about disturbance regimes, and change is the only constant. And then the question to us as agents of disturbance is, are you acting as a degenerative disturber or a regenerative disturber? And the touch too much, degeneration, clear cut the whole thing, extract it all, plunder it, is clearly, in my humble opinion, degenerative. The opposite pendulum swing, in my observation, of the no touch at all, love it, let nature heal itself, leave it alone, in these radically disastrously hammered systems, results in a degenerative scenario as well. And I think that there's a consensual Goldilocks touch in the middle where we can bring ecological literacy and humility instead of hubris to bear and work with these systems integratively and holistically towards becoming agents of regenerative disturbance. So that's what, when I'm talking about thinning, modifying vegetation and fuel loads, it's in this ethos. And for me, then it's all about, let's make some haste with zero waste because it's time to connect our fire fears with our water woes by turning our fuels into flows. And so when I see things like this by our governor, Gavin Newsom, where he's talking about nature-based solutions and achieving carbon neutrality by 2045. And imagine this one up in the upper left, there's 33.5 million acres in California, which is a 100 million acre state, that's at risk of wildfire. And there's 11, almost 12 million acres of forest that needs to be dealt with. And then you look below, and basically their targets for 2045 is to reduce wildfire risk, mostly through beneficial fire. And I'm thinking to myself, if the way you're going to get, that's a lot of acres, right? So if you're going to get to fire resiliency on 33 million acres and the only tool in the toolbox is mostly beneficial fire, it feels to me like you ain't going to get there. And what's the plan to really have a balanced beneficial biomass budget and not squander this once in a generation organic waste as a resource? And so that's where I get into this begging the question about thinking about that organic matter in the compost cycle. And thus is really born this Fuels to Flows campaign. And it's really thinking about working elementally with fire, earth, life, water, air, and then those associated governmental, county, city, state, federal entities, nonprofit, for-profit entities that are working within some of these spaces. And how do we see, and I think again for Permies, this isn't a leap here, the holistic connection and integration of all of these. And so that if fire is your concern and we're limiting and thinning forests to reduce fuel load and create healthier forests, where does that output become an input into healthy soils and input into clean water and input into carbon sequestration and GHG emissions reductions and input into biodiversity and resiliency in that regard, so that quote disaster is being mitigated or ameliorated or adapted and reduced holistically. And so while California does have a whole strategic plan for expanding the beneficial use of fire statewide, I'm pushing on, and one can dream about, I'd love a parallel report about expanding the use of beneficial biomass. And I am actively involved at the highest levels in the state and pushing this idea right now. But as planning is best done in advance, and as a good Permie, back in 2015, we at OAC and Sewing Circle did this big wildland stewardship plan. It's 200 pages and you can find it online. It's really fun. I've also published a series of articles. This one on the left is one I did for the Fremontia Journal of California Native Plant Society on mending the wild and looking at restoration there. And a lot of this for us as a coastal community in Western Sonoma County in the uplands, I've kind of been pushing on this idea of, I showed you slides earlier where we're working on low-tech process-based restoration in the riverscape and in the beaverscape and down in the lowlands. But OAC is in the uplands. So what is the uplandscape? And what are those nature-based solutions where we get fewer trees and more forest, and we have good fire and cleaner water and sequestered carbon because we're sparing the air and stuffing the gullies, and we're saving salmon and salamanders in communities simultaneously. So the right-hand side is a LiDAR map showing the 80 acres of OAC, and all of the creeks at OAC are basically what are called first order systems or class 3 ephemeral, seasonal, upland watersheds. They only run when it's raining and they're dry in the summertime. They're not fish bearing. They're not even amphibian bearing, except for in small little places in a couple sections, and I'll mention that in a bit. What's fascinating is that, in any watershed, only 10% of the surface area is really represented as blue line streams as these aquatic habitats. maybe 20% if you really want to push the boundaries on that. But the point is that 80% of any watershed is really uplands. And that's where I think there's critical action to be had. We're working hard in the riverscapes, we're working hard in the beaverscapes, but the uplandscapes, I think, have often been misunderstood and underserved. So we've been doing this work for 30 years, but we really we got legal about it, if you will. I finally pulled permits to stuff these gullies back in 2021 with the North Coast Water Quality Control Board and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in a pilot project on 4 tributaries, headwater drainages at OAC. And then we got a series of cost share funding. We got some state money. We got some federal money through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the state money through CAL FIRE, Prop 68, working with our local resource conservation district, a nonprofit called After the Fire. And over 2 years, we engaged with 40 acres over these 2 seasons with a whole suite of treatments. And it was a cost share program. And then we, as a good nonprofit, engage in a lot of education, outreach, training, skills building, demonstration, that kind of work with students. But we mainly focused with a collaboration with an amazing organization called North Bay Jobs with Justice, who now have spun off, or there's a partner entity called Resilience Works in Sonoma County. And these are immigrant, undocumented, oftentimes farm workers, indigenous peoples from Mexico, Guatemala, Central America, who have their own traditional ecological knowledge there, but they're up here doing the work. They're being exploited in industrial, agricultural settings. And so we're really doing a ecological restoration workforce training that's at the nexus of worker justice. And this has been super exciting. And we've been doing that work with them for a number of years now. And they are really doing amazing work and working all over. And so a lot of that work is getting in the woods and the forest. And again, starting with these thickets. And so the game is really, how do you disconnect ground fuel from crown fuel and do limbing and thinning and lopping and scattering or stuffing in gullies and creating habitat and doing all this work, that beneficial biomass portfolio that I was showing you. But I am clear that, there are limits to growth, but you can also limit for growth, right? And so everybody's got your own portfolio, and maybe you're like, yay, I've got upland gullies that need stuffing, and I also want to make some habitat piles. I want to use some mulching on site. I'm going to do some biochar because I'm down with that, and I'm going to make firewood. So it's my point here was this, is that it depends, which is a good design principle, right? And not every one of these tactical approaches, and there's a whole bunch that I haven't listed, are suitable for every project, but we're begging the question of people to look at their land holistically and come up with their own portfolio that meets their goals and their needs based on their on-site existing conditions. And so just looking at some case studies and opportunities, here's a project that was done on some public land. And my mantra really with this one is, why don't you spare the air and stuff the gully to save the salmon and salamanders? Because all of these burn piles where this culvert is digging out and incising that huge gully runs directly to a coho, salmon, steelhead, trout watershed, and they are suffering and dying from too much sediment in their creek. So this is dumping dirt directly into the creek to kill these listed fish. And yet they limbed and thinned this area, and now they're going to burn all that stuff. And instead of burning it, well, let's stuff the gully, and we can save money and time and spare the atmosphere while we also can save salmon and salamanders. So we've been doing this kind of work for a long time. And here's a project that we started back in 2001. You can see the magnitude of the doghair thicket of these dead and dying Doug firs that are encroaching in. And keep your eyes on that live oak over there in the kind of left. This was the end of that day back in 2001, where and all that material, we started building these beaver dam analogs and filling gullies. We revisited that 22 years later. There's the same live oaks again, and we limbed and thinned it over, and we even stuffed that gully. That's about 12 feet wide and about 4 feet deep. And there's a whole process of layering that material that I'll mention this video at the end that really goes into the details of how you open up the gully, get to the bare dirt, you lay in the green gauze of the conifers, tips up in a mesh that's like gauze where it staunches the bleeding wound and clots that. And then there's brown, green, brown, green, brown, green, a dense matrix and layering I'm making a compost pile, right? For those of you who get the brown, green, add water. And then it's going to in situ compost. And then as it composts, the adjacent tree roots of the trees that remain behind after we thinned and left the best ones are then growing into this basically hugelkultur type scenario with all of the organic matter that was super flammable. And that's now holding water, increasing groundwater recharge, elongating the flow, sequestering carbon in situ, and producing habitat for salamanders. We did this with these permits, so we were required to do monitoring. So here's just some photos of some of the projects where we started in this one big gully in our northwest corner. Jim is 6'2" there on the chainsaw, so that's a 6-foot deep gully that we ultimately filled, again, starting with a layer of green gauze on the bottom and then layering in and then ending with large, chunky, woody stuff on top that's less flammable. Here's another gully. You can see before and after on that system. That's probably 3 foot plus where Hannah's standing. Another long linear gully that we parallel packed the entire gully. Here's some head cuts where we were trying to retain some pools where we get newts breeding in them. So instead of stuffing that whole thing, we did head cut treatments that stopped the head cut migration, but retained the pool below. And we actually get it leak later longer for that. In some cases where we have a little bit of a lower gradient system that's wider, we move into perpendicular structures, more like beaver dam analogs that can then slow the water down and spread it out wider. And I'll show you a little video of some of that in a sec. Here's just some more of those. There's both there's parallel packing in that image on the right, and there's perpendicular structures. So fill the gully, kick it out, reconnect the floodplain, spread it out to the full process space that's available, and try to retain as much water on site as possible for recharge. Classic head cuts where they're migrating and stuffing those guys, another big head cut. In uplands where there is more ephemeral, seasonal, the beginnings of runnels, doing these perpendicular plethodontid palaces, as I call them, where we can intercept an incipient sheet flow and catch that material on site and wet it and slow the flow as it heads down to the deeper gullies, and then create habitat for beautiful plethodontid or lungless salamanders, which here we have 4 species at OAC. And there's a really cool study that was done back in 2013 where they did control plots with and without salamanders as a trophic cascade study. Think of these salamanders as the wolves in Yellowstone and the cruncher munchers of the organic matter, the invertebrates as the elk that were, in the absence of the salamanders, were overgrazing and over crunching and actually liberating more soil mulch to exacerbate greenhouse gas emissions. And by increasing the trophic cascade of the top predator there, this system showed that those forest soils were retaining 179 pounds of carbon per acre in the forest soil because of the presence of the salamander. So all the work we're doing in these uplands is supporting these salamander habitats. So we don't do big masticators. I'm not running rototillers on my soil. I'm not Cuisinarting and turning this into a salamander smoothie in there. It's very light touch in our thinning work. It's hand work with some chainsaw work. It's very focused. It's really attentive, and it's biologically rigorous. And then just to say, over 10 acres of area that we limbed and thinned that was in the 4 drainages that we did for our pilot project, we ultimately filled about just shy of 1,000 feet of channel, which ultimately we put in about 10,000 cubic feet of biomass, or 75 tons of carbon equivalent, is now being sequestered and composted on site, which otherwise by typical practices would have been put into burn piles and burned up and sent to the atmosphere this winter. We didn't do any burn piles. It's 100% on-site retention of all carbon into the soil water biodiversity cycles. And what's interesting about 75 tons is that's equal to the amount of carbon that Jeff Bezos used for his 11-minute little space flight. 75 tons is also the lifetime carbon budget for a billion people on the planet. The first billion people on the planet, each of their lifetime carbon budgets is 75 tons. So this is on just 10 acres. And it was our second entry into that system. It wasn't even a dog hair thicket. So imagine the 33 million acres that California needs to treat for vegetation. And if prescribed fire isn't the only tool in the toolbox, and in fact, beneficial biomass fuels to flows when appropriate and where appropriate, a diversified beneficial biomass portfolio is utilized, how many billion tons of organic matter could be retained on site for these beneficial uses? And this is that's the challenge I'm putting forward. And so I often get the, yeah, but can gully stuffing scale? How does it scale? And that question annoys me a lot. If you ask these guys, he's like, Henry, there's no way that clear cutting all this damn old growth by hand is going to scale, right? And this guy's like, Luke, quit being a naysaying whiner. You know, we've got the full weight of society behind us. These characters showed up and clear cut the greatest forest in the temperate zone of North America in a very short period of time by hand with saws and axes and misery whips and steam donkeys because they had the full weight of society behind them. So does fuels to flow scale? Does regenerative? Absolutely. It depends on the ecosystem. And if we collectively prioritize this, we can do it. If we don't, we can't. But it's not about the technique or the tactic that's not scalable. It's about the organizing. It's about the collective capacity to step up and do the work. So out of OAC and our living landscape laboratory there, we do a lot of trainings, a lot of workshops, and a lot of hands-on DIY scaling. And so we work a lot with our regional parks. We have 20,000 acres in the county. We've worked in 5 parks doing staff trainings with them. Here was a really cool project where we did a little bit of gully stuffing. And then unbeknownst to the prescribed fire folks, they did a 30-acre burn and they burned over our stuffed gully. But that gully had, the water table had risen up and the water was up near the surface. And so you can see all the white ash burned all the way down adjacent to it. But our little stuffed gully was moister and wetter. And in fact, that area didn't burn off. And so it's kind of like Smokey the Beaver. It's like Smokey the stuffed gully there. Oh, this is a really big project we did. And that's Kevin Swift in the left standing below that bridge before we removed the bridge and stuffed that entire gully 8 feet deep with fuel load there. We've been working with Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Here we're stuffing gullies with eucalyptus that they were taking out on behalf of their habitat restoration and removing that non-native species. Super fun. Working with Trout Unlimited and California Conservation Corps, Mendocino Resource Conservation District on private timberland, Mendocino Redwood Company land, doing trainings on gully stuffing in the Navarro watershed, Flynn Creek. And this is a project after we stuffed it and I turned on the switch, which is the highest place at the point in a like a keyline scenario where you go from erosional to depositional and that key point. And if you can plug up the key point and kick the flows out onto that deltaic alluvial fan, which had been dewatered because the system incised and shunted the flow, then we can wet that area and put a series of structures up on that terrace and retain more water longer. And this is a system where there's a control and a treatment, and they've got 2 years of pre-project data. And then all the way to the right is the post-project first year. And you can just see how much more water was underground based on these electronic piezometers and how much more water was above ground. And as a result of us reutilizing this waste product of this flammable fuel load. We've been doing a lot of workforce development and just with Sonoma County and a number of other nonprofits. We recently just finished a whole certificated project with a bunch of folks doing this work. And then we work statewide with folks like the Scott River Watershed Council here and this whole forest fire fuels for fens, frogs, and flows. We're working with Cascades frogs and these beautiful fens with these amazing Darlingtonia carnivorous plant bogs and cool things like that were being overtaken by conifers. Will say that we've been super inspired and have engaged a bunch with the folks in the drylands and a bunch of the work at the Cuenca de los Ojos Cienega Ranch of Valor Austin Clark and Josiah Austin and Dr. Laura Norman with USGS, who's done an amazing summary science on, and if you haven't seen that video, Regreening a Dryland Watershed by USGS, it's really worth looking at. And I love this poster of theirs, which inspired us to make our own little poster as we're working with regional parks and Sonoma RCD for our low-tech process-based restoration for upland watersheds. And so we've got these beautiful drawings done by Marianne King of the different tactical ways to integrate with these projects. A group of us put up a new website called Tending the Land for Fire Resilience in Sonoma County. Worth looking at it. It works beyond Sonoma County for sure. Things like the Community Alliance of Family Farmers. I worked with them on a booklet on gully stuffing in an agricultural scenario. We're working with other communities who are doing gully stuffing workshops. The point is this is happening all over and lots of folks have taken it on. So I just want to show you this little bit of video, and I think here's the sound.
Whoop, whoop, whoop. Happy New Year's, people. This is a Happy New Year. Look.
The real test of the structures came New Year's Day when an atmospheric river unleashed a torrent of water.
Oh, yeah, look at that.
Dolman toured the site, encouraged the structures harness the water so it would flow down the hill slower.
This used to be a deeply eroding in size channel delivering sediment to kill coho. I was just taking a walk and showing people primarily my joy, to be honest with you, and how happy I was with this gift that we were getting of all this sky water. So we're trying to model what are opportunities for landowners from an acre to more to work on vegetation management, but also take that fire fear and connect it to their water woes.
Floods aren't the only beneficiaries of leftovers from fire clearing.
Sometimes we make a special brush pile that we call a critter condo.
It's the idea that preparing for one kind of disaster can maybe help prepare for another kind too. All in a state where normal is just a word. Joe Rosado Jr.
We should all release our inner 8-year-old.
NBC Bay Area News.
You can see basically the total amount of water we were holding in that disaster of an atmospheric river, which resulted in huge flooding for a bunch of communities. And people are so freaked out about it. But if you prepared and planned ahead and done the work, we can harvest that amazing amount of abundance of sky water that was given to us. And that's kind of the take home on this. And it's just that system working. So there's another chance to see that if you want to look at it online. So, and I did just want to say that we recently did a couple DIY videos, and there's an 18-minute how to stuff a gully, and it goes into a ton of details and really gets into the prep of the gully and the prep of the materials and the type of materials and the orientation and how you lay them and the sequencing and some of the do's and don'ts and all that kind of stuff. And we also have a wonderful little animation that I think folks will find really helpful. And then for folks who like QR codes, while I'm talking about this one, here's you can go to this and there's a bunch of links that you can get to just a whole series of various resources we have on our website, but it kind of saves you the time of having to navigate through our website, which is kind of really, there's just too much content on the website. So these are some of our upland PBR resources for folks. And, you know, at some point, I guess the question really is are you a part of the solution? Or are you part of the precipitate? And, you know, I think together we could precipitate the change that's needed to work to move beyond that sense of scarcity, the disaster of scarcity, where I'm just scared in the city, to the abundance of yes, we can step up to the challenge. Sometimes you got to speak truth to power. And if that means you're wearing a foam salmon suit at the Board of Supervisors, then wear a pair of shorts like I've got there in this one so that you don't sweat too much in that suit there in the summer heat. But at some point, you know, that's what I got for you. And I'm looking forward to having some convo with y'all. And there we have it. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Oh man, thank you. What an end. Remove spotlight.
But well, I'm sorry that sound didn't come through. It did before, okay. And it was in my earphones. And I have an external mic here, so I had it on the speaker. But
okay. Yeah, maybe it was just me. But well, guys, now's your chance. If you have any questions for Brock, thank you so much. My only question for you, and then I'll let other people jump in, is have you always had a gift for like words and alliteration? Are you a poet? Are you a rapper?
I mean, I do write a lot of poetry and I spin some of those rhymes out. So I guess a little bit of Permi or eco rap. I do remember kind of when I was a teenager, my father said something to me like, can't you say that with less words? So I didn't grow up in a household that had much love for this. They weren't big on reading. They weren't big on scholastics. And so I don't know where it all comes from.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It really
but,
helps.
you know, it's, yeah, I just, you know, at the end of a PDC, people usually have a whole Brockopedia in their notes, and Brockoponics kind of a thing, right? Michelle probably has that.
Liz asked if you could show the QR code again. If you could whip that up on the screen, that'd be great. Any other questions?
Oh, for that.
Yeah, for the resources, I believe. Other questions, people can just unmute, raise your hand, or put it in the chat, and I'll try to monitor the chat. But over to everybody here. I want you to have the opportunity. Yeah, Connie, I see your hand.
Yeah, so I want to bring Lee Barnes in on this and say, Lee, is there, you know, we're up in Nashville, and we've got all this wilderness area that they're just tearing out piles and piles and piles of deadfall from last year's hurricanes, and I just would love to see if we can get in there and maybe try to bring Brock in and introduce him to some of these guys up there.
Hey, Brock, that's probably good with the screen share. Thank you.
Okay,
Appreciate
great.
that.
I didn't get it.
Yeah, great question, Connie. Go ahead, Lee. What do you think?
In my spare time, but yeah.
Well, you know all the movers and groovers up there, but I'm just thinking, you know, that's just, you know, it's breaking my heart to see all that wood just getting ripped out and just piled up on the sides of the roads. And I put a link in there of an article of that Boulder, Colorado company that's really working on mycelium in, you know, at the site, just inoculating wood that's fallen in areas. You didn't really touch on that at all, Brock, but I mean, you touched on so much that it was a great presentation. But have you been following what the problem that we've been having in Northwest North Carolina?
I have. I taught a 5-day workshop on landscape rehydration in Asheville over a decade ago, maybe almost 15 years ago. So I spent a bunch of time there, and then I was actually just there last summer for a week-long workshop. And then I went, to be honest with you, I went river snorkeling to go look at some of your endemic fish. And I was looking for hellbenders, although I didn't get to see any hellbenders, but I really wanted to. And so I was in some of those creeks, snorkeling those that got really pummeled. And I mean, I haven't seen it subsequent to that, but I have a feeling for your ecosystem, which is amazing and beautiful and wow, and just the biodiversity and complexity. I absolutely, to the degree that properties that have channels that are in conditions that have been, you know, incised and head cutting and eroding and are destabilized and could use more, stabilization. I think the beauty of your all's landscape is actually, especially in those uplands, is you're so wet and humid in the summer, and your fungal game is so quick that organic matter that you get if you layer it in brown, green, and get that compost in there will rot, and then the tree roots will grow into that thing and lock it up. And I think you could really biologically regrade a number of those upland systems with the plethora, the tragedy of how many trees the wind throw that you guys are facing. But I get it that it's a pick up sticks with a lot of work, and there's probably, you know, the tragedy is just too much, you know, that's the trauma of too much too fast, right? And you've got and people, the need to modify it and get access to places when it's just pick up sticks of trees is not an easy one. So I don't see an easy solution there, but I think there's certainly some options for folks if they had the capacity and, you know, person power and to engage. If they were that level of land manager, and had the capacity to do that, but not everybody is.
Well, it comes to my mind, Connie and Lee and all, is like even a good demonstration of that with a collected crew of people who are like, we see that, we need that massively, but we can't do it massively with the will and all the other things, but we can demonstrate it on whatever size acreage. That might be just worth doing and documenting. But those are my thoughts. Bob had a question. Actually, Josh had a question first. How do you ID a future gully? And he's relating it to streams that are 75% of the year have water in it, but during the dry season are in drought. And he's saying, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think if you're, you know, you need to know that landscape, you know, throughout a full season so that you understand it it sounds like if it's running for X period of time, 75%, but it does have a 25% moment in the dry season it's dry. You kind of need to know your landscape enough to know that that's how it behaves and that sort of thing. And if you're new to that space and you don't know that already, then like any good permaculturalist, you should go do some client interviews and find the locals and tune up on the landscape. And, before we understand that, I think maybe there's some other clues. There might be some botanical clues about certain plants that, like for us, if I find a chain fern, a woodwardia fern out here in California, I actually know that ground is saturated year round. It may not be perennially flowing, but it's saturated year round. If I find colt's foot, I've got an indicator. So there may be plants that riparian plants that only grow around year-round water, and that 25% dry season kicks some of them out, and other species like that. And I don't, there's going to be different clues. I would just, I don't know if it's a future gully or not. I think a gully really is so there's these natural waterways, and whether they run perennial or they're seasonal, it's really more about it's about the morphology of the channel. And is it in what, a pre-development stable, what's it stable and channels are dynamic and they move a lot, and there's a lot of dynamism in these systems, but there are hallmarks of where upland systems, especially after being clear cut, plowed, roaded, have had way more water discharged to them than they had historically before that disturbance happened. And that excess stream power equation, for the geeks in the house who know math, there's a whole thing. That excess energy churned it and starts digging it out and deepening it and sending up those head cuts, right? Erosion moves uphill. So when water's cascading over a nick point, the head of the nick collapses and that sediment washes downstream and it steps up. And then the nick collapses and it moves up, and the sides collapse and it moves down. And as slowly the erosion nick point, the head cut migration moves upstream, and it gets deeper and wider and deeper and wider and deeper and wider as it incisors down and head cuts up. And the thing about that is it's making a ditch. It's ditching itself. And everybody knows that if you would like to dehydrate something, an ag field, you ditch it and you drop the base elevation of where water sits, and you can laterally dehydrate the soils adjacent to that. So the insidiousness of upland head cuts is not just that they're dumping hella sediment downstream to wreak havoc on water quality and fisheries and life downstream with too much dirt in the creek, but they're also incising and reducing the upland water holding capacity of the soil sponge. And if you take any classes with D.D. Pursehouse or anybody who's really pushing the soil sponge idea a lot, you can do all the swales and the recharge you want in those uplands, but if the plug in the bathtub in the channel's been pulled 6 feet down, you're just going to laterally dehydrate that system out of the sidewalls of your incised channel. So you gotta basically re-upgrade the channel to bring it up so that the lateral cubic volume of subsurface water has an ability to be held longer. If we're going to retain and rehydrate our uplands, we have to address the drain age channels to become retain age channels.
Thank you. Bob asks, what is the relation between the steepness of a gully and the effectiveness of the gully stuffing? Are there any issues of check dams being busted?
Yeah, so absolutely. So in the world of the stream power equation, slope and volume of water are kind of the two things. So if you've got a lot of water on a really steep slope, woohoo, you've got a lot of stream power. If you got a little bit of water on a steep slope or a lot of water on a flat slope, right? So you have to understand those relationships. So the steeper it gets and the more water you've got, you're, as a permaculture designer who's doing a site assessment and have evaluated those conditions of slopes, steep, and with a lot of flow, a lot of energy, you accordingly need to, if you're going to intervene in that system, if you're going to try to slow it down, spread it out, intercept it, then you need to place material in there of the appropriate size, and you may need to anchor it. You're going to have to be more intentional about how you install it, such that to the goal that we don't want it to do is blow out. And that 18-minute long video, I get into some of that sort of stuff and talk about, what we're not really stopping the water with this gully stuffing. What we're doing is basically we're increasing a substrate where water's flowing over it, and it's actually catching organic matter and sediment, and it's filling in. And we're creating a new stream bed that we're elevating up above, but we're not blocking it in those parallel packs. Where I did the perpendiculars, and I made mention of this, but it sounds like I should repeat it, is where we got into lower gradient systems, and we had wider floodplains, so there was lateral connectivity. And then you can, like a beaver, you can block that channel up and have the top of the dam wall be dead level across its full width until it goes up the slopes. And if you can get the water to spread laterally, you can reduce the shear strength of the water. So instead of having your thumb on the end of the garden hose where you've got pressure, you spread that out, and the same volume of water. It's a level sill. For any of you guys who are doing ponds, spillways, Keyline, you make a level sill spillway, right? So that's what a beaver dam is. That's what a perpendicular structure is. So there's parallel filling pack and there's perpendicular, and they do relate to volume and slope, and they're different designs. And you need to be a good designer to understand all those tools in the toolbox.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, thanks, Bob. Good question. I don't see any other questions, and we'll pop into a breakout room just to get this, because Brock, like me, and like the focus of the summit is really thinking about, we want to make this actionable, not just information, but like how it then disseminates into our watersheds and where we're at. Looks like Michelle has a question too. Yeah, hop in, Michelle, please.
Yes, let's not let Brock go yet.
No, he's going to be in the breakout rooms.
Oh, amazing. Okay, so I have a social permaculture question related to the fuels to flows work. Could you, I mean, I know you could do hours on this. Can you talk a little bit about, for folks who are ready in their watersheds or their daisy chained in a basin of relations, who are ready to do reach outs to NGOs as well as local government? Can you talk a little bit about like steps, skills, anything in that domain about getting buy-in, and also if you could throw in working with press, if that's a factor in this piece? Thanks, because I know you've had to do that a lot.
Great question, Michelle. And I was thinking that too. Brock, you always have all these relations that you're mapping on all of your work. So yeah, let's go into that.
Yeah, well, I will say, and in the beaver space, if people aren't familiar with a technology called power mapping, that would be something worth looking at. There's some really great online resources for power mapping. But maybe Michelle, thinking about it, like in the fuels to flows work, for instance, it's really responsive to that the community, say here in California, Sonoma County, a group of us, a couple of us really, tried to start a fire safe council in West Sonoma County in 2002 and 2003. And there wasn't enough tinder in that thing. We couldn't get that fire to go, right? The fuel load was too high. We didn't have enough fuel load. And then 2015 kicked in, the big fires of Tubbs Fire, our Tubbs Fire 2017. And now everybody wants to talk about fire because they're freaked out, and there's the scarcity paradigm. A lot of us have been working on watersheds, water quality, sediment, salmon recovery kind of stuff. And I think you guys, one of you made a comment earlier in the very beginning before I started the show, which reminded me of a great quote that's often attributed to Rahm Emanuel, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And basically where I'm intervening now is that people are like, oh my God, we have to manage vegetation. We have to do defensible space. We have to do home hardening. We have to do all this work. And the government wants to support that happening, but our experience is that it's not being done in an ecologically regenerative way. It's being done in a scarcity way that's extractive and destructive. So that was our invitation to to engage in a community that already identified that it's facing a crisis. It's a disaster in the making that they're trying to prevent in advance through prescriptive forest health vegetation management. And so I think then you power map who's who. There's the governmental agencies who have the funding or the mandate that requires that, the county agencies that support that, the insurance companies that say if you don't do this and you don't clear the 0 to 5, the 30 to 100, you'll lose your insurance, you'll pay a different premium. The fire safe councils, these firewise communities, you start finding your allies of people who are clear they need to deal, they need to do something. And then we begin engaging with them. OAC is a known quantity. So we were doing workshops and trainings and hosting tours and going out and doing work for people and demonstrating the efficacy of a multi-benefit approach. And I will say it remains an uphill battle with the fire-centric firefighters, the folks who are the industrial firefighting complex but there's some pieces of that puzzle. We're not working so explicitly in the industrial commercial logging space right now. That one's it's a bit more challenging, and timber harvest plans and that realm. And not that there isn't really good work to be done there, but we're starting with non-industrial, private property, non-commercial, rural residential folks who are sitting on land and are up against the condition of the land and the fuel load and are freaked out and don't know what to do, but know they need to do something. And so we're organizing in community at scale to help each other out and garner resources, and then do the workforce training to bring to bear the capacity to implement it in a holistic way.
So I see an analog in a lot of crisis flooded areas over the last year in different parts of the U.S. Like you, I'm in a adjacent watershed with similar challenge. But after the Texas summer camp situation this summer and a whole bunch of other flood / landslide, I thought, can this soil level work, could it be mapped to be brought to these super vulnerable flood zones the way that firework here in California had, the way you scaled that? But you gave some steps, and you also gave away what not to do, which is don't shoot for the big corporate high profit people. Like, find your watershed allies, do educational or community events to get buy-in or agreement or interest, and then begin to approach very local government. Did I hear the steps in the right order? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a lot. And if throughout the slides and things, I had lots of slides where the logo of Sonoma County and our Ag and Open Space District, our Resource Conservation District, our NRCS, our California Department of Fish and Wildlife, our Regional Water Quality Control Boards, our California Air Resources Board, CAL FIRE. That's that diagram, and you can go on the website and get that fuels to flows diagram, which is why we had that rainbow set of colors of sort of the agency ecosystem map.
Right.
And the fire folks have their job to do, and the air quality folks have their job to do, and the water quality folks have their job to do, and the endangered species recovery people have their job to do. And what I'm trying to say is, I can help you get all of your jobs done holistically and integratedly if we do these projects in a way that is part of a virtuous cycle, and help solve 5 different agency mandates simultaneously. And therefore the funding and the permitting, they should all say, amazing, we will we'll get together as a group of agencies and reduce our permitting barriers such that we can then also come up with a funding stream. And if the project costs $100,000, well, then let the fire people pony up $20,000 for the veg management to generate the biomass, and let the air quality people pony up 20 grand for all the carbon I'm going to sequester. That's a GHG reduction that they get to benefit from. And the water quality people pony up 20 grand for the clean water that's sediment free I'm producing. And the salmon restoration people would pony up 20 grand, right? And so I'm pushing on right now integrated permitting, regulatory, and funding packages cross agency to drive holistic integrated projects under the guise of fuels to flows.
Michelle's saying it all. Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Have you been directly involved, or your work has been directly involved in changing policy? That's a thing that has come up a fair amount, is like, we need to change policy, of course, to change massive effects. What sort of, I mean, you kind of gave the
Yeah.
leading steps to that, but what about your work has affected policy?
Yeah. So OAC's kind of theory of change or strategies of change is really the demonstration, to do it. If I'm going to get on a soapbox and tell people to do stuff, I damn well better have done it myself. And in my experience, when I did, ... And then there's the education, the chaining, the education piece, the training change makers, capacity building. And then our fourth one is rule change, as politics and policy, if you will. And so I was part of a crew with Art Ludwig and Laura Allen and, Elizabeth Doherty and a whole smattering of folks. I'm sorry to you guys who I'm not listening right now, who we, through a legislative process that went to Housing and Community Development, participated in a public process, and we collectively rewrote Chapter 16A of the Uniform Plumbing Code for California to legalize gray water. So gray water is legal throughout California, branch drain systems and laundry landscape systems, if you follow 10 different steps that are specified without a permit from the state anymore. That was like 15 years ago. So we basically kind of legalized roof water harvesting in the context of holding that water in the winter for the dry season as an offset to extraction of water on behalf of in-stream flows for salmonids. We've been deep in and out of our compost toilet project and legalizing that one. That was more complicated, and we haven't won that one yet. I will say our beaver campaign, when I started pushing beavers in the 90s, they were thought of as non-native nuisances and rodents, and they were being killed by the thousands. Within the past couple of years, there's a statewide program. It has 5 permanent staff. They're relocating them. We have a $2 million grant for doing beaver coexistence training workshops in partnership with Beaver Institute on that thing. So yeah, we're in the thick of permaculture is political. I brought forward in 2000 under the California, there are things called general plans at counties and city levels. They're the land use constitution of your community. They say what can be built and done where. And if you aren't participating in the general plan for your community, then guess who is? And if you're not happy with that settlement or that building or that industrial park or whatever's being zoned for these parcels, then you got to get involved in the general planning process. So I got involved, never having done anything. And pretty quickly, I'm like, there's these required elements. And I see transportation, I see housing, I see open space, but I don't see the element of life. Water doesn't even have its own damn element. And I studied up, and turns out that there are optional elements you can propose. So I wrote up a thing, 3 minutes at the podium, and said, I suggest you guys adopt a water resource element as a standalone. And through a bunch of cajoling, Sonoma County did adopt that. We're the first county in the state to adopt a standalone water resource element, and all elements have to be internally consistent with every other element. So the housing element has to be consistent with all the water element components, the transportation element. So you can influence land use policy. And in that water element, we wrote in gray water, we wrote in stormwater, we wrote in slow spread at sinking, we wrote in roof water harvesting, we wrote in right? So you can seed that thing with Easter eggs. And then once the general plan is adopted, then you get to go to the Board of Soups and go, hey, by the way, I'd like to do an ordinance on compost toilet. And they're like, well, we've never heard of that. I'm like, well, actually, it's section so of the general plan in the water resource element you approved right here. And they're like, oh, okay. Right. So planning is best done in advance. And right now, I don't want to get into the state of federal things, but we're getting our asses kicked if we aren't engaged in legalizing sustainability, legalizing permaculture, right? In many communities, or at least we are in California. So yeah, all in on policy.
Love it. And you can come dressed as a salmon, apparently. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I've done sea turtles, tiger salamanders, salmon, beavers. Yeah, I have a whole council of all beings experience with that game.
Good for you. Yeah.
Politics
Anybody
is a
else
circus.
bubbling up questions that must be asked? Now is your chance. And it's okay if not. Good stuff, Brock. Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
Well, I was just going to seed. So yesterday, Brock, we had a presentation from a friend and Watershed resident neighbor of Lee's, and maybe whoever else is here, about creek restoration that was done and the effects. And they are having trouble with the beaver. They mentioned a lot. There was also a mention of how if you plant enough the right aquatic plants, beaver will go plenty for those and not as much for certain tree bark. But I just thought I'd love to see a brief cross country dialogue about beaver, and whatever wisdom you have about how to help beaver not be a nuisance as they're doing all their hydrology.
Yeah, that was
What state are we in?
North Carolina. That was Patrick Battle, who you may know. He's been doing some great river restoration projects, and they did an amazing thing, and it was like the best the reviewer had ever seen. But he did note that the beaver were eating a lot of the trees, and his proposed solution was to build a pond first with all sorts of aquatic plants and line it with willow year one, and then do the restoration year 2, 3, whatever. That way the beaver have a place to live and stuff to eat, and they won't eat the restored plants that you put in.
Yeah. So there is a whole world of beaver coexistence out there. And in fact, East Coast is kind of leading the way. And I would recommend that you go to Beaver Institute, the work of Mike Callahan. He's up in Massachusetts. There are, and he has a whole training called the Beaver Core training. And there's just a laundry list of different opportunities to engage with mitigating some of the behaviors of beaver if they're doing those things to, things you don't want them to do. Chewing trees is an interesting one. If it's a big tree, there's a whole tree wrapping protocol with wire that you can save those trees. If you've just done a brand new restoration, you put in a bunch of baby plants or you're sprigging willows in there and things like that, I think you oversprigged the bejesus out of it. And willows and beavers have been together for 7 million years, and they coppice like crazy. And I think the key would have been, and it sounds like he's saying in phase 2, is recognizing that if you're doing a restoration in a watershed, in an extreme that has beavers right now, you plan accordingly for the beavers to be engaged as restoration partners with you as part of the design up front. I don't know about making a pond in advance and planning or not, but it sounds like he had that kind of epiphany about let's think about the beavers in design, because the idea that folks are working in riverine systems that have existing beavers and they don't think about the beaver as a part of their restoration, and then they get pissed at the beaver because it's a variable in the equation, that they blame the beaver for not having had the smarts to think about the beaver. And I'm not ready to throw the beaver under the bus on that one. I'm kind of going to keep the focus on the two-legged, the cerebral imperviousness in the headwaters of the lack of neuroplasticity. As a Indy, I see a comment, which I'm a deep devotee of neuroplasticity. And in our upland, our headwaters in the brain, what we do know, and through MRIs and looking at different communities of folks, is you can get very entrenched thinking. And some folks in mono-minded worlds have systems, and their neural connectivity and the amount of neural activity that accesses all of the brain network gets very reduced. And these studies have been shown, and you can have a look at it. And so I think a lot about education, training, puns, art, science as like beaver dam analogs in the brain, where you can start to fill up these entrenched neural networks and reconnect to other parts of the brain and other hemispheres in front and back, and rehydrate the headwaters through mitigating cerebral imperviousness through this neuroplasticity. Puns are a great beaver headwaters BDA for sure.
You know what else is good for that is psychedelic plants, particularly psilocybin. But
Yeah,
go ahead. What's your thought on that as a biologist?
Oh, I would say you're a fun guy, and my celium honors your celium. That's what I would say in that one.
Go ahead, Michelle. No. I thought I saw your hand. Okay, great. Mycelium honors your celium. Okay, cool.
But yes, I where appropriate for people who have the cultural setting and the context and capacity to engage with those really powerful beings. Um, there's some good medicine. I actually have a whole shirt on today.
Get behind the
Get behind the medicine.
medicine.
And it's a whole group. I don't know if I can show you the back. Can you see the back?
Something conservationist. Hold
Anyway,
on.
it's about indigenous conservation for
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can
for
spotlight you.
for this.
Ah.
Yeah, for sacred medicine. So
Yeah.
forest for peyote, for mushrooms, for ibogaine, for
To me,
toad, for ayahuasca,
that
for
yes,
all of
yes.
those.
That conversation really comes into the issue that a lot of us permaculturists and whole systems thinkers have, which is like our culture is so siloed and kind of like monochromatic, and like we just do things as they've been done, and we're not whole systems thinkers as a society. And one of the fastest ways to change consciousness and maybe reach a tipping point in a society or for ecological change is the pairing and the partnering with these powerful medicines. So that's my little 2 cents on that. But
Yeah. You know, Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind is a really interesting read for folks who want to explore this.
yeah. Well,
And Paul Stamets has a new book out on psilocybin.
oh yeah, Paul Stamets. Have you worked much with Paul Stamets at all in your work over the years?
Yeah, I have. Actually, a permaculture related story. Penny Livingston and I and Paul were all presenting at the Bioneers Conference many years ago in San Rafael. And then she has a place in Point Reyes Station, it used to be called PINC, Permaculture Institute of Northern California, before it was Regenerative Design Institute, RDI. And so the three of us went back to Penny's place. We crashed after Bioneers. We got up that next morning. We're having coffee and breakfast early in the morning and that kind of stuff. We probably enjoyed a little bit of cannabis for the morning. And then we were wandering around her little 1 acre permy garden. It was super fun. And she had some aquaculture ponds that she had dug out, and there were these aquaponics little systems and things. And she had a bunch of oyster mushroom logs that she had stacked up. And at one point, when you're ready to get them to flush, you smack them on a rock and then kind of kick them off, and then you dunk them in the water like a branch fell in the rain and hit the ground, and that kicks off the mycelium to fruit. And so we're walking, and all of a sudden she's like, freaks out. She's like, oh my God, I put these oyster mushroom log in the pond like 2 months ago. I totally forgot about them. She's off teaching PDCs or something. So we're like, oh no, let's go look at them. So we reach down and we grab one of these logs. They're like 4 foot, 3-inch sort of, where they've been drilled, and, the spawn put in with the plugs. And as she pulls it up, it's kind of stuck, and then the thing pops out. It's vertically in the water, and she pulls it up, and at the bottom, under like 3 feet more of water, where there was all that chinampa muck in the bottom of that anaerobic, aquaponics pond, there was this. It came up with this black club foot on the whole bottom of the log, and she pulls the thing out. And she's like, "What the hell is going on?" And then the water starts running off it, and Paul touches it, and he sees the threads of mycelium. So the oyster mushroom mycelium had run into the muck 3 feet underwater, anaerobic muck, and was feeding on that. And Paul just freaks out. He's like, oh my God, mycelium running. And then he looks up at it, he's like, title of my next book. And then he basically goes back and if you've seen mycelium running, that's where the title is.
That's a great anecdote. That's one of my favorite books ever. Wow.
That's a great book. So there you have it.
And what role does, like, Connie posted a link earlier about mycoremediation, spores on chainsaws and that sort of thing. Is that part of your fuels to flows? Like it's one tool in the toolkit?
We haven't been explicitly using that myceliated bar oil per se. It's super fun, and a bunch of friends use it. But I would say that the way we're stuffing gullies with the green and brown and the heavy duty organics and the things, and putting it down there and wetting it by our own design. I've gotten some beautiful turkey tails for us. You got to fight the turkey tails back. And as people know, or maybe don't know, they're incredibly medicinal. They're really important as a saprophytic fungus. But I've also gotten some oysters on them. I've gotten a lion's mane out of a stuffed gully at one point. So I allow the intelligence of the existing native saprophytic fungus, which our forest is really loaded up with, to just invade and take over and begin the breakdown process of composting these systems to the degree that the sort of mycorrhizal type fungi get in there as the tree roots grow in there. I'm not sure I've seen that with like the agaricuses or the boletes or the chanterelles yet or anything like that, but certainly the saprophytics love gully stuffing.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Well, we're winding down, guys. I think we'll skip the breakout room, but time for maybe one more question, and then we'll just do a little in the chat from this conversation. Awesome workshop, or rather, awesome presentation and inspiration from Brock. What are you all looking to sort of like do in terms of like, oh, you know, this is what I could do in my town or with my community or with my group? Not to put you on the spot, just to turn these sort of inspiration into action as best as we can. Is there any areas of, you know, obvious not reforestation but restoration work that are needed in your area? Maybe put that in the chat just as an affirmation toward action. And yeah, if anybody else has a question, we've got 5 minutes left and we'll close at 8. So this has been great, Brock. Thank you so much.
Sure, I'm happy. Yeah, hit me up.
Yeah, well, Corrine is going to document this, some of your work, Brock, in we're putting together a series of toolkits on disaster response and recovery. So that'll definitely make it in there. Thank you, Corrine.
I'm
Sharon?
putting in a web link for the Common Social Change Library, who have some of the best resources on power mapping.
Fantastic. Thank you. Go ahead, Michelle.
This is thank you, Brock. Always headwaters restoration, expansion, cleaning, and inspiring. A request, or if today's presentation in some form isn't on the OAC website, and we would love to show that, like at a town hall meeting or a local educational event. Is there a way to rent it or purchase it? Like, today's presentation has legs.
Well, this is being recorded, so I'm assuming, you know, you could always, and then, you know, if you Google me or look me up, I'm a mouthy character. There's way too many recordings of me saying things to audiences and various in this topic.
Okay.
There's probably half a dozen of these Fuels to Flow shows that are living on in YouTube
Like
or other people
already. Okay.
Yeah, there's a bunch of that stuff.
And
And then you should definitely watch those little videos we made, which I think are 18-minute.
Great.
I haven't checked in the last month, but that thing got like 60,000 hits in a month. And I was like, really? 60,000 people are watching an 18-minute video about how to stuff gullies? I was like, oh my God.
Something's changing.
I guess, right?
That's great. Yeah, and Michelle, since Brock kind of gave permission there, I'm happy to share this once we have it up on the Pina YouTube with you, and you can use it however you'd like. One quick question is, Sabina asked, do you know of anyone doing this work on the East Coast or in the Midwest, Brock?
Not explicitly, like yeah, no. You know, somebody like Eric Toensmeyer, he would be a great resource. He himself probably isn't explicitly doing it, but he and I've worked together a lot beyond just the food forest stuff, and he gets this kind of work, and he's such a resource in the, you know, he's in Western Mass kind of area. So for the Northeastern angle, Eric might be a good somebody to reach out to. But otherwise, yeah, I'm not super fluent.
Which, you know,
geography
might be an opportunity for someone here to take over that mantle and start to lead the way. So, guys, this has been wonderful. We'll end like I always do with a nice, deep, slow breath in and out and sort of let it go. But if you have any final in 2 words, what has this presentation or this experience been for you? Put them in the chat. It's always good to read things like that. Brock, this is wonderful. Keep doing the amazing work that you're doing, and we hope to weave back in with you with Pina at some point on your future projects. So wonderful.
Yay. Well, happy to be with you all. Thank you, Pina. As you all maybe know, you know, OAC's PDCs are Pina PDCs. Your logos on the certificates we give out. So we're continue to support Pina as we can as one location. So thanks for doing all that.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Well, guys, nice deep breath in whenever you're ready. And as you do, just notice your shoulders, your feet, your jaw. And as you breathe out, just sort of letting go of the presentation, this awesome group gathering, and on to the next thing. I hope you all have a wonderful Friday. Thank you.
All right. Bye, y'all.